Lecture 2, Ottoman Background.
Today I want to begin this lecture series by going into the deep background of the history of Palestine. In order to understand the history of modern Palestine and subsequent events, what we have to do is begin with the Ottoman period. The reason for this is that the Ottoman Empire ruled Palestine for over 400 years, from 1517 until the end of World War I, when the empire was dismantled by the victorious Entente powers. Therefore, in order to be able to understand the modern history of Palestine, the empire to which it belonged must become the central focus of this lecture and the next one. Now, last time we talked about the relevant details of the Islamic background of Palestine. The territory which is now called Palestine was one of the core areas of Islam. Arabs had been moving from the Arabian Peninsula north into the Palestine area even before the rise of Islam. Part of the reason for this is that Palestine was on the major trade route between Arabia on the one hand and the Byzantine Empire on the other hand. Palestine was thus one of the first areas that was integrated into the great Islamic empire once the Islamic armies began to roll out of Arabia. But there was a theological reason why Palestine is important for early Islamic history as well. Islam is what is known as an Abrahamic religion. It follows in the tradition of Abraham in a manner similar to Christianity on the one hand and Judaism on the other. And of course, Abraham had a very important role to play in the subsequent mythology that has arisen about Palestine and so on and so forth, since he emigrated from Iraq, from Ur, to Palestine to settle with his tribe. Muhammad embarked on his night journey to heaven from Jerusalem, from the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And initially, the Muslims prayed in the direction of Jerusalem, not in the direction of Mecca. And this demonstrates the centrality of Palestine to the Islamic tradition. Over time, most of the inhabitants of Palestine converted to Islam and adopted Arabic as their native language. Now, at first, the Islamic world was politically united under a caliph. The word caliph comes from the Arabic word khalifa, meaning successor, in this case, successor to Muhammad. But the political unity of the Islamic world did not last very long. You have to remember this was a pre-modern empire. It was difficult to keep an empire together, particularly one that stretched all the way from Spain on the one hand to the borders of Iran and beyond, and further north as well. Beginning, therefore, in around the 8th century or so, the Islamic empire began to divide into a series of smaller principalities, smaller empires. And this process was facilitated by the influx of Turkic peoples. This influx began to occur in about the 10th century or so, who moved into the area, into the Islamic world, from the north. Now, nobody really knows why the Turkic peoples began to migrate into the Islamic world, into the core area of the Islamic world. There's various theories that historians have. Some historians talk about population pressures. Others talk about climatic changes or changes within the Chinese empire that threw the Turkic peoples further south. On the other hand, it would probably be justified to say, how do you keep them down on the farm in Kazakhstan after they've seen the bright lights and cityscape of Baghdad? Obviously, there was a great deal of attraction for a center of high culture, such as what the Islamic world could provide. Anyway, many of the Turkic tribes that began to migrate into the region starting in around the 10th century or so, established independent principalities. Once these principalities were established, many of these tribes converted to Islam. Now, sometimes bands of Turkic warriors would form in frontier areas and raided into the domains of either other principalities on the one hand or the Byzantine Empire on the other hand. One such band formed in the area adjacent to the frontier of the Byzantine Empire. And this group was founded by a warrior, a Turkic warrior, by the name of Osman. Osman is the legendary founder of the Ottoman Empire, and he gave his name to the Ottoman Empire, which is still referred to in Turkish and in Arabic as Osmanli, as the Empire of Osman. In 1453, the Turks conquered Constantinople. Constantinople had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, of course, was the successor state to the Roman Empire. And so what, in effect, the Turks had done was put an end to the Roman Empire that had lasted for over a millennium and a half. In 1516, the Ottomans began their conquest of the Middle East. At its height, the empire was huge, stretching from the Balkans in Europe, from southeastern Europe to the Middle East, and across North Africa to Morocco. The very famous saying by Metternich, the 19th century Austrian statesman, that, quote, Asia begins at the eastern gates of Vienna. What he was referring to, of course, was the Ottoman domains. Now, as I said earlier, the Ottoman Empire ruled Palestine for over 400 years. Either it was extremely lucky, or it was able to adapt to changing circumstances. Now, I prefer to think the latter. By accepting the notion, however, that the Ottoman Empire was able to change over the course in history, we still have to keep in mind the fact that there were certain aspects of the Ottoman Empire that remained the same throughout all of Ottoman history. And today what I want to do is to highlight those aspects that remained the same and to discuss their importance for our understanding the history of Palestine. Let's start in the center and at the top of the Ottoman Empire. At the center of the Ottoman system was a sultan. The sultan was a member of the House of Osman and was the only one at the time who was the ruler. In other words, the previous Mongol tradition had divided up the empires. Kings had divided up their empires among their sons. In the Ottoman case, however, the son, the one child, would become the sultan at the end of the rule of his father. In the beginning, the sultan was the warrior chief, the person who would lead the troops into battle. But as the Ottoman Empire expanded to the natural limits that it could expand to, the importance of a warrior chief became less pronounced. And the Ottoman Sultan, therefore, began to rule through a bureaucracy that could administer a far-flung empire, a bureaucracy that could, for example, tax its population and use that taxation in order to build an army and so on. Throughout this period, however, throughout the period of the Ottoman reign, dominion of Palestine, the Ottomans, sultans, used Palestine for prestige purposes. The walls of Jerusalem, the famous walls of Jerusalem, for example, were built by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, also known as Suleiman Kanuni, the lawgiver. Suleiman the Magnificent ruled during the time of Elizabeth I or Philip II of Spain during the 16th century. But this, of course, did not stay. The importance of Palestine for personal prestige of the sultans was not just an early modern phenomenon. Into the modern period, for example, Sultan Abdul Hamid II built a very famous clock tower and fountain outside the Jaffa Gate of Jerusalem to commemorate his 25th anniversary. So Palestine had an importance for the sultans of the Ottoman Empire in terms of prestige. Another reason why Palestine was important is that the Ottoman Empire was a Muslim empire. This doesn't mean, of course, that everybody in the empire was Muslim. As a matter of fact, there was very, very large populations within the empire that were Christian, also populations that were Jewish, and populations that were of a variety of other religious persuasions. Nevertheless, law in the Ottoman Empire was based upon Sharia, upon the Islamic legal code. Of course, what would go on is, as in any system of law, it had to be adapted to the various times, and so therefore the Sultan would add his own rescripts into the Sharia in order to ensure that it would be practicable for the period in which he was living. The Sultan sometimes, not commonly, but sometimes also adopted the title of Caliph, in himself putting himself right in the footsteps of the early caliphs, the early successors to Muhammad. Now, the Islamic character of the empire had important repercussions for Palestine. At times, the Ottoman Sultan sponsored public works in Jerusalem, as I said, and Jerusalem, of course, is the third holiest city in Islam after Mecca and Medina. The Ottoman sultans also invested a great deal of value in ensuring the safety of the Hajj caravan, the annual pilgrimage caravan that left from Istanbul and went down through Syria, through Damascus, Egypt, and eventually ended up in Arabia. Supplying the caravan was a great economic boon to Palestine, the area through which the caravan had to pass. And so therefore Palestinians or people who are living there, merchants, farmers, and so on and so forth, would sell goods, would sell their services to the Hajj caravan as it was coming through town. And since the caravan was such an important symbol, the Ottomans could ill afford to have the caravan looted by wandering bands of Bedouin. So therefore, what they began to do in certain periods was to build and man stockades, garrisons throughout the caravan route. This would not only ensure the safety of the caravans, but would also ensure the safety of peasants. And if the peasants were safe, they could expand the area under agricultural development, and therefore the demography, the population of Palestine would increase whenever these garrisons would be fully manned. Now, so far, I've been talking about the importance of Islam in terms of the state and state ideology, what it meant to the caliph, to the sultan, how he adopted the title of caliph, etc., etc. But Islam, as it was practiced among the population of Palestine, varied widely. There were differences in practices depending upon urban or rural, depending upon rich or poor, depending upon whether you were a scholar or a Sufi mystic or a member of a minority that considered itself Islamic but was outside the four recognized schools of law. Thus, to understand Islam among the population of Palestine, I think it would benefit us to look at the words of a French traveler to Palestine. He wrote the following about the following incident in the 18th century, a discussion that he had with a local Bedouin sheikh. "Why?" asked the Bedouin sheikh, "do you wish to return among the Franks," meaning, of course, the Europeans? "Since you have no aversion to our manners, since you know how to use a lance and manage a horse like a Bedouin, why don't you stay among us? We shall give you cloaks, a tent, a virtuous and young Bedouin girl, and a good blood mare." Being a Frenchman, he probably didn't care much about the virtue of the Bedouin girl. "You shall live in our house." "But do you not know," replied I, "that born among the Franks, I have been educated in their religion? In what light will the Arabs view an infidel, or will they think of me as an apostate?" "And do you not yourself perceive," said he, "that the Arabs live without troubling themselves either about the Prophet or the Quran? Every man with us follows the direction of his conscience. Men have a right to judge of actions, but religion itself must be left to God alone." Now, obviously, this story went through several versions before it was finally written down and transmitted to the rest of us. I'm not quite sure that we can't say the story was, there's too many negatives in this sentence. The story is probably as embroidered as a cloak that was promised to the traveler, in other words. But there's a grain of truth to it, as I said. Islam itself went through many different forms, was practiced in many different ways, both at any given period of time or over history. The third important aspect of Ottoman rule has to do with the problem of land tenure. I wouldn't inflict this on you unless I thought it was very important. I realize that people's eyes tend to glaze over as soon as we talk about property and real estate and how ownership occurred. But it is important, inasmuch as the Ottomans had a system that was very different than the system that we are familiar with. We're familiar with a system in which people hold property, hold the title to property. The Ottomans themselves, for the most part and for most of Ottoman history, land belonged to the ruling dynasty. Almost all of the land in the Ottoman Empire belonged to the ruling dynasty. Now, peasants had they were free, but they did not have unconditional rights to the land that they worked. For the most part, the peasants had the right to live on, to work, and to enjoy the fruits of their lands, but they did not hold them as freehold lands, nor could they sell them. Sometimes the Ottoman government would give land as a grant to special individuals who would perform services for the Ottoman government. Sometimes these services would include administration. Sometimes they would include raising local levy of troops and going to war for the Ottomans. At other times, the Ottomans allowed people to collect the taxes for them, and in exchange for that, to pretty much have control over the land from which they were able to extract the taxes. Getting rid of these middlemen, called tax farmers, would become a very important issue in 19th century Ottoman history. Now, during that century, during the 19th century, the Ottoman government decided that its manner of running the empire was inefficient, that they were going to have to remodel their running of the empire, and this, of course, meant that land owning had to be restructured. Remember, we're dealing with a period in history where most wealth comes from agricultural production. If you want taxes, if you want tribute, all that could be traced to industrial production. There were very few dot-coms in the 19th century in the Ottoman Empire. In the 19th century, therefore, the Ottoman Empire allowed private ownership of land. While, in effect, there had been private ownership of land before this, in the 19th century, the government recognized the private ownership of land. Peasants, for example, would be allowed to claim plots of land for their own. They would be allowed to alienate that land, to sell that land. They were able to reap the benefits of that land. Now, this change in the Ottoman Land Code is embodied in the Ottoman Land Code of 1858. And this law would have dramatic consequences for Palestine. The private ownership of land, and we'll see why in a later lecture, ended up with notable families, urban-based notable families, for the most part controlling the land. They would accumulate large plots of land and be willing to alienate it since they had no attachment to it. When Zionist land buyers, Jewish nationalist land buyers, would come to Palestine in the 19th century and ask these notables, do you have any land for us to buy? They would look at the price that the Zionists were willing to pay, which was a very substantial amount, and they would say, hey, I'm living in Lebanon now. What the heck do I need land for example, in Palestine? Sure, you can have it. In other words, that this facilitated Zionist immigration into Palestine. The fourth aspect of the Ottoman Empire that's important for us is that sometimes the central empire was the central government of the empire was strong, sometimes it was relatively weak. Now, when I say strong, I mean, of course, also relatively strong, because we are dealing with an early modern empire here, and they didn't have the capacity to control, nor the desire to control, the population and the territory that we associate with a modern nation state. In the very beginning, through the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, as I said, the 16th century, the Ottoman government was stronger than most local warlords, most local forces, and was able to maintain central control. Now, although scholars disagree, many assert that in Syria and Palestine, this ability to maintain central control lasted through the first decades of the 18th century. During this period, the Ottomans were able to halt Bedouin raids into villages and towns. They were able to expand rural security. And this, of course, as I said before, allowed for the expansion of trade and for the expansion of agricultural development. It's important to note, however, that even during this period, there were areas of Palestine that the Ottomans could not control directly. For example, as we discussed last time, there is a spine of hills that go through central Palestine. The spine of hills is associated with the Nablus area, in part. And in the Nablus area, the Ottomans were their control was very, very tenuous. So what the governor of this area had to do was, in order to collect taxes, he had to perform what was called a dawra. Dawra comes from an Arabic word meaning circle. He would go through the province of Nablus in a circular form, starting out from the city and then ending up back at the city, passing through as many villages as he could, showing the flag, the Ottoman flag, and demanding taxes and tribute. He would come back, spend a while in his own residence, and then go back and perform this dawra again. That was the extent, for example, of Ottoman control over Nablus. During the second half of the 18th century and continuing through the first half of the 19th century, however, local warlords were able to assert their power against the central government and against central authority. In the 18th century, two such warlords emerged in Palestine. In northern Palestine, a warlord of Bedouin origins by the name of Zahar al-Omar established control over the area that is around the city of Acre. A former slave from Egypt, Ahmed Pasha al-Jazar, established control a little bit later around the area of Saida, which is in present-day Lebanon. This is a very important port, and he was able to control the countryside from this port. Now, while he was recognized by the Ottomans as a governor, in other words, they co-opted him into the Ottoman system, he was a rather ornery character. In the same way that kings develop these names, Philip the Bold, Alexander the Great, and so on and so forth, Ahmed Pasha al-Jazar got the name Ahmed Pasha al-Jazar as-Safah. As-Safah is an Arabic word meaning the butcher. He was a notoriously cranky fellow. The story has it that, therefore, after he died, his servants waited several days before they would dare enter his chamber to see that he had died. They wanted to make sure, and the way they made sure was they waited until his body began to stink, and in that way they knew that they weren't bothering Jazar, and in that way they knew that they wouldn't have their, literally, heads handed to them. Now, both Jazar and Zahar al-Omar chose to establish their capitals on the coast for a reason, and that reason was because of the growing importance of international commerce during this period, which had important implications for the future of Palestine. The Industrial Revolution, if we all remember, started off with textiles, and the best quality cotton in the entire Ottoman Empire came from the Galilee region of Palestine. In the early 1700s, French traders had established themselves in both Saida and Acre, and traders from other nations began to follow suit. As European competition increased for a limited amount of cotton, peasants began to expand their production of cotton, and it became a major export for the region. Dahar al-Omar established his control over what one historian has called a cotton principality, and traded cotton for European weapons, a trade that I'm sure the Ottomans didn't look favorably upon. Dahar rebuilt Acre, and he actually was the one to establish the city of Haifa with the proceeds from this trade. In 1775, the Ottoman government, fearing Dahar's growing power and autonomy, sent a naval force to Acre and recognized Jazar, Dahar al-Omar's rival, as the governor. Jazar maintained his region's dependence on cotton. He knew a good thing when he saw it. And this would have disastrous implications for that region of Palestine in the future. Remember Eli Whitney and his invention of the cotton gin in 1793. This meant that the area under cotton cultivation in the American South expanded massively and glutted the market. By 1852, cotton exports and prices dropped 90%, and many farmers in the Galilee region went into bankruptcy. What's important about this story is, of course, the fact, not just the effect of the cotton trade on the individual farmers, but the fact that the Palestinian economy was now increasingly being linked into a world economy. And we'll get more into that next time. Now, not all the warlords were local. Some of these warlords, or the most important of these warlords, who was able to maintain control over Palestine, came from Egypt. He was the most significant warlord of the time, Muhammad Ali, who became the viceroy of Egypt, who wanted to assert his autonomy from the Ottoman Empire. And so therefore Muhammad Ali sent his son, Ibrahim Pasha, north to take control over Palestine and Syria, to gain control of the natural resources of the region, and as well to take control of a very strategic part of the Mediterranean. The Egyptians controlled Syria and Palestine for 10 years, from 1831 to 1841. During that time, Ibrahim Pasha introduced policies into the region that would have profound effects on later Palestinian history. For example, he introduced conscription on the French model. He would introduce direct taxation, for example, to accumulate money necessary for military adventures. He expanded the cultivation of cash crops, which would be sold abroad for public exchange. And he increased measures to increase security and to expand trade. Now, the population of Palestine was rarely enthusiastic about what Ibrahim Pasha was doing. A British traveler to the region, Mary Eliza Rogers, tells the following story in her memoirs about her journey to Palestine. Quote, "My acquaintance Muhammad had lost the use of one eye. In answer to my inquiry, he told me that his mother had purposely destroyed the sight by application of poisonous leaves when he was young, to render him unfit for service in the army. This practice was very common in Egypt until Ibrahim Pasha put an effectual stop to it by ordering a regiment to be formed entirely of one-eyed men, and every one who had lost the sight of an eye, either by accident or by design, was compelled to join it. Muhammad, among others, was enrolled, and the Cyclops Regiment became the most formidable in the Egyptian service." Now, when the Ottomans were able to throw Ibrahim Pasha out with British help, they maintained many of the processes that Ibrahim Pasha had put into effect. We'll talk about this more in the upcoming lecture.